Welcome to our Bible study. We continue our study of the Lord's Church, and this is the 10th series or 10th lesson in this series of lessons on the church. Before we enter into our lesson, I would like to remind everybody of the fact that we are worshiping every Sunday morning at 9:30 at the Oakwood Road Church of Christ. Our service lasts approximately 45 minutes to an hour. We record this service, and barring any problems, that service is available at 11 o'clock on the church website. We're worshiping Sunday night at 6 o'clock, and then Wednesday night at 7 o'clock, we have Bible classes for all ages. We encourage you to come out and worship with us if you can physically. We understand some people, because of health concerns and issues, are unable to be out. But if you can be out among other people at your job, your recreation, whatever, we'd encourage you to come and worship with us physically. But if you are unable to be out because of health concerns, obviously we would like for you to worship with us virtually. And there's other congregations, of course, that make their services available. The In Search of the Lord's Way program out of Edmond, Oklahoma is on Sunday mornings at 7:30 on DirecTV channel 47, on Dish TV channel 239, and Spectrum Cable channel 3. In addition to this program, there are, of course, many other congregations that either use Facebook Live or YouTube or some other venue to broadcast their services. In addition, we mention every week the Gospel Broadcasting Network and also the World Video Bible School. These are two excellent resources with tremendous amounts of Bible material available, background studies of books of the Bible, character studies, even dealing with different languages, debates, all kinds of different Bible-related topics. Most of the material is either free or very, very cheap at a minimal cost. So we encourage you to check out these resources if you haven't, so you can know more about God and His will. As we've emphasized in this series of lessons, the church was in God's mind even before the creation of humanity. As human beings, we have a tremendous ability to really mess up what God gives us and wants us to do. And I think this has happened with the church. Many times people have a very negative attitude toward organized religion, and I understand that on various levels, because the church or Jesus, as they look at the Gospels, doesn't seem to be reflected in much of modern day religion. Well, Jesus, when he came to this world, didn't accept everything that was religious. He realized the Pharisees and others had basically made a mockery of the Judaism of the Old Testament. But the fact that people sometimes mess up and maybe change what God's will is concerning the church doesn't mean it's not important. But the church was in God's mind even before the creation of humanity, and we find this in Ephesians, the 3rd chapter. The kingdom prophecies of the Old Testament are fulfilled in the church in the New Testament. This is a very important point. There's such a misunderstanding in the world today concerning the kingdom, the idea that God never established the kingdom that Christ was sent to establish. So the teaching is that somehow at the last second, God decides to put the church in place until Christ can return and establish a kingdom. And this simply is not Bible teaching. Christ promised to build his church. And so the church is definitely something important. Everything Jesus did and taught was important. So if he promised to build his church, then we should go to the New Testament to see what that church is. We think about what the church is. First of all, it's not an earthly kingdom in the sense of a powerful force in the world, or Christians don't use physical armies to increase their borders just as our physical nations do. Christ told Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world." Christ didn't deny having a kingdom. He just said it was not of this world. Second, the church is not a forerunner to an earthly kingdom. As I've already mentioned, the modern doctrine of dispensational premillennialism teaches that at some point in always the near future, that Christ is going to return and establish the kingdom that was prophesied in the Old Testament. At that point, the church basically would be done away with. But Christ uses the phrases church and kingdom interchangeably in Matthew 16, 18 through 19. And also, the church is not a denomination. Or that we meaning that if we can follow Christ and his teachings and simply follow what he says concerning the church, then we belong to him. And the church, of course, belongs to Christ. And so we need to reflect that in our lives. With that in mind, we've been emphasizing the topic of worship the last 2 weeks. This is the third lesson in that series, and we'll conclude our lessons on worship tonight concerning the church and worship. But if God, or rather Jesus, is speaking to the woman at the well at Samaria in John chapter 4, and he says, God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. There's much value in this passage, obviously, the idea that God is to be worshiped a certain way. He's deserving of our worship. But we have to worship him in spirit and in truth. I would say in truth means according to the way that God has authorized or told us to worship Him. Also in spirit could involve the right attitude in our worship. And obviously, that's a part of worshiping God in truth. If our heart is to be right, if our minds are to be right with God, then we need to worship Him the way that He tells us to. Paul says in Colossians 3:17, "Whatsoever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God and the Father by Him." To do something in someone's name is to do it by that person's authority. And everything we are to do religiously, we are to have the authority of Christ behind us. As far as our teaching, it should be by the authority of Christ. Our actions should be by the authority of Christ. And how we worship God should be by the authority of Christ. With that in mind, we're going to look at some different worship concerns tonight as we conclude this third lesson on worship. And this has to do mainly with our modern culture, modern day America, and maybe just the world in general. But can acts of worship also be used for one's entertainment? We need to think about this as far as how God tells us we are to worship Him. Should churches be interested in new, quote, forms of worship which attract many consumer conscious people? This is a very prevalent attitude in a lot of the church growth movement that we talk about seekers, people seeking God's will. So we need to sort of meet them halfway, so to speak. So we sort of, change our worship a little bit. Some congregations even have Saturday services where God's not even mentioned, Jesus isn't even mentioned, and basically maybe a rock band comes in and performs, sort of very slowly introduce these people to Jesus. And then there's maybe another service on Sunday morning following that for people who want to learn a little bit more about God. And then finally, what they call the traditional service. Does worship exclusively occur during the Sunday assembly and never any other time? This is something that I've heard a lot of people say that, well, whatever's done Sunday morning is worship and it's never worship any other time. And I think there's some misunderstanding concerning that statement. But remember that we are to worship God in spirit and in truth. John chapter 4 and verse 24. With that in mind, we've looked at these verbs the last 2 weeks as far as worship is concerned. The first one is proskuneo, and it's, I think, one of the most prevalent words used in the New Testament, and it means to worship, to prostrate oneself before, due reverence to. Of course, the preposition pra or pro, meaning before, coming before somebody. And we think of coming before God to worship Him. The wise men told Herod that they had seen his star, of course, the star of Jesus in the east, and they came to worship Him. They came to bow down before Jesus, to show Him reverence, to show Him respect. Jesus told Satan in Matthew 4:10, "You shall worship the Lord your God, and Him only you shall serve." Proskuneo has been described as an inner attitude of adoration expressed in a physical manner. So as we think about proskuneo, we're reminded of the idea that we have the right attitude behind what we're doing, but also it's done physically. The second one is sebamine. This word is not used as frequently. This word has a very strong sense of respect and reverence in it, to have fear and reverence. It's used in Matthew 15:9 when Jesus talks about the uh, Pharisees worshiping Him in vain, teaching His doctrine, the commandments of men. And Paul, it's used of Paul as he leaves in Acts chapter 18 and verse 7. And there's a house of a certain man named Justus who worshiped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. And this word gives you the nuance maybe of a sense of fear and respect when we come before God. And so as we enter worship, we're reminded of the fact that we have a personal God who cares about us, obviously, and most importantly, by sending Jesus to die for us. But even though He's very personal and cares about what we're going through, He also is to be worshiped with reverence and respect. And we need to consider that when we enter into worship of God. Worship should please God, not man. And by that, I'm not saying that we can't be happy in our worship. Obviously, we should be pleased to worship God. But we need to be worshiping the way God has authorized in His will. And we're here to please God, not just ourselves. 1 Samuel 13 tells the story of the king, Saul, who was from the tribe of Benjamin. He was not from the tribe of Levi. He was not a priest or a Levite. He had no right to offer a sacrifice. When Samuel delays coming to offer a sacrifice before Saul goes into battle, Saul takes it upon himself to offer that sacrifice. But he was not authorized to do such, and actually the kingdom is removed from him for doing this. Also, we read about King Uzziah, who goes into the temple against uh, the priest and Levites who are upset with him, saying he has no right to go into the holy of holies and to burn incense. He did that. He was not authorized to do such, and of course, God struck him with leprosy for this act against God. So the point is that worship is either subject to the authority of God or it is not. In other words, there are some people who say, well, everything you do is worship, and they use worship in this vague way. Worship, very specifically, is an act that we begin with and we end with. We read in Acts the 8th chapter that the Ethiopian eunuch had traveled to Jerusalem to worship. And so he came there for a specific purpose, to be there, to worship God. So when we think about worship pleasing God, what we're saying is we should worship God the way he has authorized and not the way we want to author or do it. As I mentioned last week in our study, we look at our Sunday services. We go back to the example in the New Testament. The early church met on the first day of the week. They communed. They came together to eat the Lord's Supper. They heard lessons from God's will. They gave of their means. They prayed, and of course, they sang hymns to God. And this is a picture of an early worship service 2,000 years ago. A man by the name of John MacArthur, talking about Showtime religion, sort of hits a nail on the head concerning modern day worship. And maybe some of you have seen many of these programs on television where basically, quote, worship services have been turned into something similar to a rock concert or just some type of a big religious drama. Church buildings are being constructed like theaters. Instead of a pulpit, the focus is a stage. The congregation is served a slick professional show in which drama, pop music, and maybe a soft South sermon constitute the worship service. Society is filled with people who want what they want when they want it. Why not have a real carnival? A tattooed knife thrower who juggles chainsaws could do his thing, while a barker shouts Bible verses. That'd draw a crowd, wouldn't it? Punk rockers, ventriloquists, dummies, clowns, and show business celebrities have taken the place of the preacher, and they are degrading the gospel. And I think excuse me, I think Mr. MacArthur again hits the nail on the head. There's a segment of our culture who is attracted to these such things, and there are certain preachers and religions who very much are offering it to the people, just simply what they want in the name of religion. With that in mind, I want to talk about just a couple of issues sometimes that have come up, and that is, what about acts of worship when they're done outside of the assembly? The Bible describes prayer as an act of worship. Actually, teaching is an act of worship, as we find Matthew chapter 15 and verse 9. Singing hymns to God is an act of worship. And so some people have said that, well, if there's only one person, there's not really worship. There have to be at least two people present for worship to occur. And they've used this to basically say it's okay to use instrumental music if you're not in, quote, the assembly. They take the passage from Matthew chapter 18 and verse 20, where Jesus says, for where two or three are gathered together in my name, I am there in the midst of them. In the context, the word for ties into the passage of church discipline. And if you look at the context of two previous verses, Jesus is saying when people agree on the matter of church discipline, God is with them in that agreement. But even then, the point being, if the passage we're discussing worship, does it exclude God's presence when one worships alone? You don't have to have more than one person, excuse me, to be able to worship God. Bible examples, Psalm 138:2, I will worship toward your holy temple. David talking about praying towards and looking toward the holy temple. Matthew 18:8-2 talks about a leper coming to Jesus and worships him. He's worshiping him by himself. He's the only one. Matthew 15:25, a woman approaches Jesus and says, then she came and worshipped him, saying, it didn't have to be various people involved. Acts 16:25, it says, midnight Paul and Silas were praying and singing to God. They were worshiping God as they were in prison. Let me ask you a question concerning that. If Paul were singing and praying by himself, would it not be worship? Obviously, it would be. And so the doctrine that you have to have at least two people to make it worship, and therefore the next step that is taken is, well, since if there's only one person there, you can listen to instrumental music, songs of praise to God using instruments, since it's, quote, not worship. And Matthew 18 should not be used to support that doctrine. And again, people get into this idea of, well, one cannot worship unless there's an intent to do so. And I understand that. Yeah, you can't. You have to have an intent to worship. But the issue is, can we use things that are inherently holy as matters of entertainment to please us? And talking about the Lord's Supper, saying, well, every time you eat crackers or drink grape juice, you're not taking the Lord's Supper. Aubrey Johnson says the illustration is invalid because the issue is not the drinking of the grape juice, but the consumption of it in connection with the Lord's Supper. If a group wants to get together on Tuesday night and partake of the memorial for their own enjoyment, can they do so as long as they say it's not their intent to worship? To do so would be to profane what is sacred. Psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs are sacred. Those who sing them must be careful to treat them with the respect and reverence they deserve. We need to think about that. I know many Christians think there's nothing wrong with using instrumental music as long as, quote, it's not used on a Sunday morning service. But we need to ask ourselves again the question, where's our authority to do such? And if that's the case, would it be right to take other acts of worship and use them for our own entertainment or our own enjoyment? As we look at 1 Corinthians 11, 17 through chapter 14, I think it's interesting that the word worship is not even used in these 4 chapters. They describe what we call acts of worship: singing, praying, of course, teaching of God's will, and then later on giving in 1 Corinthians 16. But in these chapters, the singing, the praying, the Lord's Supper, and teaching are mentioned. Of course, 1 Corinthians 16 mentions the idea of giving on the first day of the week. The reason we call this a worship assembly is because these individual items are acts of worship. And so, we think many times, well, this is a worship assembly, and it is, but it's significant to me that that word worship is not even used in these chapters. Lord's Supper, praying, and singing to God, by definition, are worship. Teaching is worship. Giving is an act of worship. Obviously, the act of giving is not inherently worship, but when done on the Lord's Day in the assembly, it is worship. Eating crackers and drinking grape juice is not worship, but when done on the first day of the week to remember the death of Jesus, it becomes worship. So let's remember the importance of worshiping God the way He is authorized, the idea that we should worship Him in spirit and in truth, the idea that God tells us how we're to worship Him. And it's a privilege and an honor to be able to worship God. And finally, can one use acts of worship to be entertained? I think some questions we need to ask or answer. Would it be proper to pray through Mary or to count the rosary if it were not done in the assembly? What Bible passages regulating prayer can find it as an act of worship to the assembly? Also, is it proper to use hymns of praise to God as, quote, entertainment at youth rallies and other gatherings? Is it proper to use instrumental music with such hymns because there is no intent to worship? Where is our authority to do such? So, again, I'm reminded of the fact that even though this is something that might be practiced by many people, our question needs to be, where's our authority for such? We thank you for being with us in our Bible study. We look forward to having you study with us next week.